All right, so we're going to create some silly Android code today, and we're looking at specifically how to do events with Android. And so in events, we have a couple things. We have the idea in AppInventor land, we have our AppInventor blocks we have to deal with, our components that we have, and our Android components and our methods we have to deal with. And so we have the idea with this that we have different pieces we've been using. So in AppInventor, simply to make an app that could change color of something when we click the button and randomly do it, all we have to do is just make a simple button. In that button, we pass it the block for the set background color to make a color, passing it a list, and then passing that make list 3 random variables, or 3 random numbers, going from 0 to 255. So it'll randomly get some red, some green, some blue, our RGB value. Not a lot of work. All we had to do to create this on AppInventor was simply just add this first button right there of the button, and then drag its click method over, and then all the other component pieces, or all the other blocks, are already built into Android. However, to do this inside, or already built into AppInventor, do this in Android, we have to do a little bit more. We have some things we have to actually deal with. So on every Java GUI, we have the idea of a listener. And a listener is that special method that's always on. It's always listening. And so it's waiting for its specific event to happen, whether it's to scroll on a scroll bar, to click a button, to move over something with a mouse, or on Android when you slide across it with your finger. The listener is always waiting for that to happen. And so this works for Java in general for GUI, but also for Android as well. It's always waiting for that component to have an event happen. And so for Android, we have a couple requirements we have to deal with. We have a couple parts we're going to need. Obviously, we need a button. We already need to have a layout. And every one of these is going to need an ID. So when we specify these in our XML file, we want to make sure that that ID is actually identified and that ID is easy to deal with. So we'll deal with that in just a bit. Obviously, we're going to deal with some imports because we're adding things to our project, so imports are going to always happen. And we have a special method called findViewById. The findViewById method is how Android actually deals with locating the component pieces for the GUI. You find all the pieces in there by finding its ID, and we'll see how to do that in just a bit. In our code, we're going to have a declaration section just like in regular Java. We want to have our private data members declared. And then we'll initialize them, however, in our onCreate method because, again, in activities in Android, unlike a regular Java project, we're not going to use our constructor. But Tyler, we're going to make sure that we don't fight with Jacob. But we're going to make sure in our onCreate method, we're going to inflate those by using the onCreate method and its findViewById. It requires us to do something in Java we haven't done before yet. It's called casting, because everything in Android is what's called a view. So everything we can see is a view. And it goes kind of back to that model view controller we were talking about earlier. And we'll address that some more, but we have to actually tell it what we want it to look like. And if we don't tell it to look like the right thing, we can make our app crash. That's pretty fantastic. For SetupListeners, we have a method that I'll be using with you guys in class. We'll use this on all of our GUI-based approach, whether it be Java with Android or regular Java programming. And I call it a SetupListeners method. It's just a nice little private helper method that we use to keep our code clean and organized. And in our SetupListeners method, we are going to be calling that method in our onCreate inside Android. And so at the very end of the onCreate method, our last line of onCreate, we're going to call SetupListeners, just like we have in our onCreate method. We already have to call those first 2 things at the very beginning. Our first being super.onCreate, and then our second line we have to call setContentView. So we know that we have to have a couple requirements for our onCreate method at the beginning, at the end of the file, or excuse me, at the beginning and the end of the method. And everything that you want to have listen for an event needs to have its own listener attached to it. So each button needs one. So in the case right here, we have myButton.setOnClickListener, and then some code that goes attached to it. So you have to attach the listener to the button itself. Otherwise, it's just listening and it doesn't know what to do. Here we have the sample code. Actually, we're going to be typing up on this in a bit. And so we have our private void SetupListeners. As I said, it's a helper method. We are a button, and we set the listener for it, and it passes it a new View.OnClickListener. And so what we're doing right here is we're creating a new listener for it. And then we have, as a required method, all listeners have required methods, and a onClickListener has the required method of onClick. It has to be public, it needs to be void, it needs to be called onClick. The parameter needs to be a view type, but the name of the parameter doesn't matter. I will call it button view or button or click or something that actually makes sense because it's what it's dealing with, because that onClick event, that view or whatever that is attached to it, I want to make sure if I need to use it, I know what I'm actually dealing with by a variable. So in this case, it's a button view because the onClick is attached to a button. And then any actions I want to do inside that method are going to go inside these squiggles right here. So this is where, when I click the button, what I want to have happen needs to be referenced inside this chunk of code right here. And so that is where we're going to give the information for it. So I would have a method call in there, would be a great way to do it. Or if it's just a single event, I could do a single line of code. But that's where this would all happen, is in the onClick. That's where all of our action is going to happen for a listener specifically. And it's required, it's where all our action happens. So we have right now our Android project that we made last time. We have over here a whole bunch of stuff that we were dealing with. And we want to go ahead and first we want to talk about the idea that we have the listeners and stuff to make sure we have that ready to go. So we're going to go over to our view page. Remember, our view is in the layout folder and it ends in XML. And with the rules for our XML, we can't have any capital letters in the title, and we separate everything with underscores. And I can either double click on it right here to reopen it, or I can simply just click on the tab that was already open over here. And I'm going to maximize this just so we can see it a little bit better. And again, in our palette, we have a couple pieces right here. I have a text thing right here, and I changed the text size so it's a little bit more visible. I set it to 30. I have my button right here, and my button I'm going to make sure it has an ID. And I can do that by going over here by selecting the button in the view component, or the viewer. And then I look over in my properties list. I go to ID, and oh look, I have an ID for it. It's called stupid button. And we had stupid yesterday. Let's go ahead and let's change this to be silly button. Let's make it a little bit better, a little nicer name today. So this will be our silly button. And again, if you rename your references inside the GUI part, the design tab right here of XML file, it'll rename it across the board in all your other files. That does not happen if you rename it over here in the text side. So if you're looking to do some design changes, I actively encourage you to do your renaming and updating on the design side rather than the text side, because it will update all of your code attached to it automatically. And so I will say yes. And so that will change all my references on it for that to now be silly button. And I have my text view. My text view needs an ID as well, so I'm going to go over here to ID instead of calling it text view, because text view doesn't say anything about it. And I'll call this silly text. Again, it gives me a reference for it. And notice that when I call it when I give it a name or a valid ID that's not just text view, it then says, here's your ID name. And then here's what kind of thing it is inside parentheses in our outline section of our component tree. And so this was a very nice tool to identify what our components are for our actual project. I'm going to give my layout an ID as well, because again, I want to have everything that I'm using or having a reference to, it needs to have an ID. And so I'm going to just call this background layout. So again, by giving everything a reference, it gives me I can name things, I can then refer to it inside my code. And so I want to be able to refer to them in order to do that, I have to have an ID for it so I can provide a reference. Because that ID reference will be used in the findViewById method that we just talked about a minute ago. So we've got that right there. I have not done any new code or anything. All I've done is just added IDs to all three of my components that exist inside my view. If I look over here at my text side to look at the changes that happen, all it does is it adds the line right here, at sign plus ID, silly button is the android:id value. And this one has an at plus ID silly text. And then my layout has an at ID background layout. Again, I want to give names to everything that I would possibly want to reference. If I never need to use it, I wouldn't need to give it an ID, but then I probably wouldn't actually need it in my project. So just keep that in mind. Now, I'm not going to close this project file right here because I'm still going to need it, but I want to switch over to my Java file. because my Java file is where all of my coding happens. So we're over here in our Java file. We're looking at what we have set up. And we have, just like in a regular Java file, we have our basic structure. We have our onCreate method that we've talked about already, which it acts like the constructor for Java. But in Android development, we use our onCreate method to do all of our initialization. So we need to go ahead and declare references to all of our things we need to use. We do that in our declaration section, which, just like Java, is at the top of the file. The type for button, this is going to be really weird, is a button type. Oh, so I have a private button. And I'm going to call it, let's say, for example, what's a good name for our button? We'll have a private button, and we can call it, say, silly button. Color change button. Android Studio is telling me, hey, I need to import this. It's giving me this lovely little thing. I can have an auto import with that. But again, I want you to avoid using the auto imports. It's really nice, especially as we first learn coding, to do the imports manually. And so I go up here, I go to my import section. And for all of the components in the Android toolkit that we'll be using to start off with, it's going to be import, and then Android, then .widget. And that's the package for it. In this case, it's a button, so we type in button and a semicolon. So I now have a button called colorChangeButton that's declared. Can't use it yet, but I've declared it. And I'm going to get a text view for my text, so I can see that. So private text view. Helps if I get my typing properly. And this is my basic text, because it's really basic. And so what would I import for my text view if I imported a android.widget.button for a button? What do you think I import for my text view? Import android.widget.textView, yes. Not Android. And then for my background or my layout, I need to get a reference to that. And so I'm going to do private. And it is a relative layout. And I'll call this background. And again, import android.widget.relative layout. Yes, Android wants to let me type it in automatically for them, but again, I want to practice by typing in, get that muscle memory and that visual cue of where I need to put my code. So generally, if it doesn't belong to you yourself, like it's not something you made, you always have an import statement up here for it. And so if you are using something in your code and you didn't make it, you'll have an import statement. In this case, the button, the text view, the relative layout, those are all provided by Android. So I need to make sure I import them in my import statement. So I have my declaration section here, and I declared each of them as a private variable because my visibility, these do not need to be touched by anyone else. These are private values. It's like, again, no one needs to reach inside your brain and squish it to make you think things. You make your own thinking decisions yourself. But in order to initialize them now, I need to go into my onCreate. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit here. And again, remembering that in our onCreate, we have a couple rules that we have to follow. Our onCreate method acts like our constructor. And the first two lines must be super.onCreate, passing it that save instance state bundle object. And the second line needs to be set content view and passing it r.layout. Whatever the name of that layout is. In this case, activity stupid morning. Because it was our stupid project, we're changing it now to be our silly project, but you know, that's okay. Now, this is something new. This is especially where I want you to make sure you take notes, especially if you're learning Android for the first time. In order to deal with our component pieces for Android compared to Java, it's a little bit different. So when we make a thing in Java, we say thing, my thing equals new thing. But when we're doing it for Android, if it's a GUI component, we don't follow that structure. Our GUI component for Android is different. Our GUI for regular Java will be the same as regular Java code, but GUI for Android is special, so make sure you have this in notes. So what I have to do is I say I'm going to start with my background because it's the bottom one that I can see easily. Background equals, and then in parens, the type of thing it is. It's a relative layout, as I can see from right here. So I put in parens, I put relative layout, and then a space, and then I call a method findViewById. And what that is going to do is it's going to give a return whatever's inside this method call and make sure it fits as a relative layout object, and then shove it into my background variable. So I have to call the method, make sure I turn it into that thing, because what happens is Android stores all of these things as what's called a view. So I'm going to find that view by its ID, and I find that by typing in R.id. And what did I name my background view? Background layout. Oh, there it is, right there. So I call it background layout. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's really important to name your things that make sense to you and that are unique to your project. Because if you don't, you could drag in some random thing and it'll cause your app to crash. We don't want to do that. You have to make sure you choose the right object for this. So this thing right here, r.id.background needs to refer to your XML to be what is a relative layout in this case. So background layout, or if we look at the design thing, it needs to be the what the layout is. So whatever I ask about here in this file, and I name it like this, needs to be of this kind right here when I refer to it in my Java file. So in your notes, I recommend putting something like the type needs to match what you declare it as in the view. So if I put it if I say that this is a button type, and if it's a if it's a progress bar type, or if it's a seek bar type, or if it's a spinner, or if it's a web view, if it's any one of those things, when I refer to it over here in code, I need to make sure that first I declare it as that type, and then in my onCreate, when I refer to it, I have to make sure I put parens around it right here to cast it to that type. And so I'm going to do the same thing now for my other two components. I'm going to make my text view, so it's basic text. Basic text equals, and then parens, it's what type? It's a text view, so I go type in text view right here. And then I call the method findViewById. And in parens, it's r.id. And I named it, I think, silly text. I did, silly text. And semicolon at the end. And finally, the same thing for my button, my color button equals, it's a type button. And I then call my method findViewById. And I called this one r.id.sillyButton. So I have now initialized all three of my data members. So initialization in Android, we have the process where it's the thing equals parens around the type, a space, and then the method called findViewById. And then in findViewById's parameter, we pass it the ID tag, doing r.id. name of the ID. So it's very important that we have that in our notes, that we will always need the thing, the type in parens, the method call, and then we pass it the ID value for it. So make sure you have that in your notes. That this would be a great screenshot to grab and identify this is how you initialize and declare objects inside an Android screen. So here's the declaration section. We can even make it so we can fit the imports as well. There we go. Even better screenshot. So here we have the imports required for those components. We have the actual components themselves declared in our declaration section. And then we have the initialization of those components inside my onCreate method. So yeah, this would be a great screenshot and a great set of concepts to put in your notes. And so this initialization section is very different from what we saw inside regular Java code. So please make sure this chunk right here is specifically defined in your code or in your notes, that you have a reference to that. The next thing we have is we're going to call a method called SetupListeners. Now SetupListeners is my method. It's not built in by anyone. We have to make it ourselves. So right now it's going to give us an error message because we haven't written it yet. And it's a helper method. And so helper methods most of the time are private. So I'm going to just go down here to the bottom of my file. Collapse this code out of here. And a private void method called SetupListeners. And even if I only have one button in my project, I will always call the SetupListeners just because most of the time in a GUI, you're doing more than one thing. And so for good programming practice, I'm going to have it so it's always available with that same basic structure. So private void SetupListeners. And what I do is I go to my lovely little top of my file up here. And I have that reference to that button. That button is the one I'm going to be dealing with. And so I do the color change button. Dot set onClickListener. And then a parens. Inside my parens, so the parameter I'm giving it, I'm going to do a new view dot onClickListener. And then I'm going to press the enter key, give it a squiggle and a semicolon right there. So this looks a little bit different because what I'm doing is I'm building a complex code structure to go inside this. So inside that, it requires to have a method called public void onClick. And I pass it a view, and I'm going to call it button click. And it's saying, oh, I need to import android.view.View. It's giving me an error for that. So I'm going to go up to my import statement, and I'm going to add an import for import android.view.View. And so now that will get rid of my error messages that are attached to that. And then again, a note to myself inside my squiggles. My note right there, this is where the action happens. So again, I wrote this with you guys. This code is available for lots of different things. There are, again, if you see there's an option for, like, say, an autocomplete, don't take it. So if you're having formatting errors, the first thing to always check are your squiggles. So on private void SetupListeners, I have my outer set of squiggles. I have my color change set on ClickListener, where it has a squiggle set right here, but then there's this parens that closes actually right here, and a semicolon. Because what this is actually one huge giant line of code. But because it's such a huge giant line of code, we're splitting it up like we would normally. Because this opening right here, if you look at it highlight, I have that, it's orange right here, and it's also orange down here. This is all attached to the set on ClickListener method. So I have an orange parens right here, a matching orange parens right here. This is all one giant single method call, so that's probably what usually that's going to happen. I have an open and close parens for this inside it, so it's a method call that calls an object that has a special method definition inside it. Right now we've got the framework code for our app. Now we just need to do the part where on AppInventor, where we have that set background color to making a color. So we need to do this part right now. We just made the dot click. The dot click is this. The onClick right here. And all the code that's attached to it is getting this orange block. So that orange block that we made in AppInventor just by dragging over. We're at this spot right here inside this. So these squiggles represent the inside of the orange block. So this is what it takes to get from that spot to here. So we're doing some changes with that. And so if you notice on this, we want to set the background color to a random color for all those things. So let's make a random color for red, green, and blue. Now it's always best to put things that happen in a method. So I'm going to go up here and make a method that I can call inside here. So it's going to be a private method because no one else will call it. It's a void method because it's not going to be giving me anything back. And change background. So I have private void change background color. And I'm going to call it right here, right after my comment. So that way I can have it as a method that I can do. So my onClick is where it calls the method. The onClick is inside the setOnClickListener, which is inside my SetupListeners. My method for change background color, because again I want to extract my code into chunks that I can possibly reuse later on, or call in other methods if necessary. And so it's a private method because right now no one else needs to see it. So we need to get some random numbers. So I'm going to say an int red color, int green color, and int blue color. What it is these are only visible inside these squiggles. So they have no visibility at all outside of that. So if it's visible, like if it's in a method or in some other block of code, there is no other visibility that they could have. So you can't make them public, private, or anything. They are simply just local variables to that method. They only exist right here. They don't exist anywhere else. So I can't talk about red color out here or up here. I can only talk about red color between those squiggles. So they're local variables and they're visible only inside the squiggles themselves. And so we want to grab we need to get a random value for each of them. So I'm going to say that my red color, and I'm doing this on multiple lines so we can see the steps for it each time. So I declared the variable. Let's initialize our variable now. So red color and then equals to shove a value inside it. And so I'm saying red color equals in parens int math.random times 256. So math.random right here will give me a random number somewhere between 0 and 1. So it can include 0, but it won't include 1. So everyone remember your number lines in elementary school / junior high, where you had the filled in circle and the open circle? With math.random, between that 0 and 1, the 0 is a filled in circle. And the question was, why are we doing 256 if it only goes to 255? The 0 is a filled in circle. It includes 0. The 1 is the open circle. It won't include that number. So up to but not including 1 means if I multiply it by 256, the biggest possible value will be 255. Of course. Because it'll be 0 times 256 gives me 0. 0.999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999 times 256 gives me 255. Because an int doesn't care about any decimals. So let's do that same line of code for green and blue as well. So green color equals parens int, and then parens math.random times 256. And again, just like in the real world, order of operations matters in Java, so my parens happen first. So I'm going to do math.random times 256, grab that whole number, and then I'm going to turn it into an int. If I didn't do that first, if I just did this, if I did it like that for blue color, it would not give me a int value to turn into it. So I need to make sure I turn it into an int first. And I do that by putting the parens in front, just like I did with my view. Up here, where I turned it into a button. So it takes the findViewById, it turns into a button. This takes a double value, some decimal number, and turns it into an int. So we have to turn numbers into, we have to turn views into buttons. Up here, down here I have to turn decimal numbers into an integer number with this. Because I have to make sure I only want the int value for the color. Because my colors aren't decimals, my colors are integers. We're going to set our background color, passing it color.RGB, and we'll give it that red color, that green color, and blue color. So those pieces right there will make it so we can change the color of our thing every time we click the button. So, red color, we grab it, we have to turn it into an int by passing this information. Do the same thing for green color and blue color. And then we set the background color of that to the components from that, passing it color.RGB, which is a method. And we'll pass color.RGB that value, red, green, and blue. We successfully made it so it changes our background color of our app. We can also make it so it changes the background color of other components. So I could go to my button and change its background color, but I want it to be a different background color because I want to be able to see my button. So I'm going to do the same line of code again. And red color equals parens int. So I'm casting it as an int. And then in parens, I'm going to do some math. All right, so we want to continue working on with the idea of how to actually show what our app looks like after making those changes. So taking a quick look again at our code, we have over here inside our thing, we have our declaration of our variables and all of that. We went and made a method called changeColors, and in that changeColors, we declared a few variables. We have an int variable called red color, green color, and blue color. We then randomly made it so we could grab those variable values. We did, we cast them as from a double value because of math.random as an int, so we can pass them to the method. And then we're going to go ahead and give them the idea that we're going to pass that value using color.RGB. We'll grab that color that comes out of that, make a new random color from those random values we have, and we'll have it so it'll set the background of our app based on that. And then we decided, let's add this as well, so we can make a color for the button change as well. And we have that right here, and we regenerate the random values for the red, green, and blue, and then have that to change the color of the button as well. Again, to do that, we just had a method right here called changeColors that we called inside our listener for our object. We did colorChangeButton.setOnClickListener. Inside its onClick method, we added the changeColors method. And as we take a look at the actual application here in practice, we have it right here. And we can click on the button. And every time we click, we see a change color between both the background of the screen and the background of the button because we use the reference over here, background on that for setting the background color, and then background for the color change button as well. Every time we click it, it changes the colors for both of them to a new random value.